Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer. This is my story, continuation of the heritage of my life. Now, this one is a little bit more complicated, and I don't want it to be, excuse me, drawn out too long. As you may remember, in the previous one, I was telling you about when I went to mime school, and I was living in Harrow. I had a room and I had a telephone line that I never actually ended up paying for, and so on. And I finished at the mime school with visions of getting an agent, going into video and, getting into films and using those new skills that I had acquired in special effects, in creatures, in fantasy things, and all of that sort of thing. And also at some point I wanted to tour around and perform mime. And I was going to mime shows in London and watching people like John Mowat, the Theatre de Complicité, the Moving Picture Mime Show, David Glass, people like that who were around at the time. Well, I was still living in London. I had this place and I needed to earn a living. That was one of the big problems, of course, living in London. It's not cheap. And I needed something fairly quickly. So looking in, I think it was the back of the stage, there was an advert for security guards. So I became a security guard for a company called Argus Shield. I still remember them, and I think they paid me the grand total of £3.10 an hour. Now, this must have been in '86, a year of Chernobyl. So it wasn't a huge wage, except that, of course, I was doing 12-hour shifts as a security guard. So I remember having the interview, being checked. You had to have all your stuff checked. But basically, they would take you on, and I was hired immediately. They must have been desperate. And then they did these checks, sort of over the following week. So I could have been anybody going into all sorts of prestigious buildings until finally these checks were done. That always surprised me. So it's never surprised me how people can get in and do some terrible things, particularly terrorists, because there's a number of these professions where the turnover is so quick that they don't have the time to check you out. I remember doing all sorts of other jobs up in London where you were trying to sell membership to eating clubs, and you would buy this big wad of tickets, and you were trying to sell them in Oxford Street and stopping people to say, would you like to buy this? You can get 20% discount in various restaurants if you buy this great big book. And various other schemes, telephone schemes, where you would, be in an office and ring people up and all this. But it was all on spec. They never paid you a wage. And in the end, I tried a few of those, hated it, didn't like them. So I became this security guard. I was slightly nervous because I've never liked confrontation, and I've never wanted to get into a fight and anything like that. So I've always been slightly nervous of any sort of physical fisticuffs or anything, but I was assured it would be perfectly fine. So I worked as a security guard in a uniform at various different places. Now, the places I want to tell you about are three interesting places. The one was for the Heidelberg factory, which was in Brentford. Not Brentwood. Hang on. There's Brentwood and there's Brentford, and I forget which one it was. The one in West London, not the town in Essex. Anyway, there was Heidelberg with these printing presses, and of course I knew about printing. I was fascinated. These were these great big platen printing presses from the old days that they manufactured and presumably sold a few, but mainly looked after, I think. But they had a showroom, and then they had a workshop in the back. And my job as a security guard was to turn up at 7 o'clock in the evening and sit mainly in the front office overnight till 7 o'clock in the morning as a security guard on my own, with every 2 hours a patrol of the building. Now, in those days, you would patrol around, make sure everything's fine, and you would carry this clock. This clock was a circular thing wrapped in leather, as I recall, with a strap. And around the premises were a number of keys. And these were special keys that you would insert into this clock and turn. What happened was, as you turned it, as I understand it, there was a roll of paper on the inside, or card, and as you turned it, a punch would punch this roll of paper in a certain position, which noted the time that you actually did it. So it was a timekeeping clock, a sort of primitive thing. I mean, now it would all be digital, of course. But the reason you did that was to prove that you had been to these various specific points in the premises at the said time, that the company had agreed with the security company. So Heidelberg had agreed with the security company, and the guard would go around every 2 hours and check. One was the ladies' lav, I remember. One was the workshop. A couple were in the offices on the second floor, and of course in the showroom. And so there were a number of places that this patrol took, and it took about 20-25 minutes to walk around the whole building. Of course, other security guards like to wind up people, especially new guards. And I remember one of them saying to me, he said, "Oh, you know, this place is haunted. It was built originally on plague pits. And in the dead of night, you can often hear the voices of these poor people who died of the Great Plague of 1665, screaming or moving about." And of course, I was very young. I was in my early 20s. And I was very impressionable. And a big old building as this was, you know, at night, you hear it settling. So you do hear those creaks and those groans and those things. And of course, it put it put the wind up me, I can tell you. And so there I was at these specific times, you know, so I'd probably go in at 7 o'clock, do the first patrol, and then at 9, and then at 11, and all through the night, you know, every 2 hours. And I would hear this building creak, and I was always nervous that there were people in the building. Burglars would come in, and if they were discovered, being quite a big building, they could be working at one end of the building. You wouldn't necessarily know because you were right at the front office. It was quite a large building with lots of different rooms and things. So you'd never know unless an alarm went off. And I thought if there were people hiding in the building wanting to steal things or whatever, and they were disturbed by a security guard coming around doing his rounds, winding this clock with all these different keys, that they may hide, wait till you pass, and then whack you on the head. So I always felt that any minute somebody was going to bash me over the head. You didn't have a crash helmet or anything. It was just a silly flat cap. Most ridiculous. And me, I was a weedy little chap back then. And so what I did was to counteract that. I figured that if I was to sing loudly, there was nobody else in the building, so it didn't matter. If I sang loudly, people would hear me coming. So they would hide, and I reasoned that if they heard me coming, doing my round, they might leave me alone, assuming there was anybody there, of course, and then I could get back to the front office and just sit there, twiddle my thumbs. I did a lot of reading, of course, and wait for the next 2 hour and go round. One of the other things I had to do was ring to the office, I think every hour, just to let them know that I was okay and that there was nothing to report. You would just ring and go, "Hi, yeah, nothing here," etc. So I walked around singing my heart out, going through this, so hoping that if anybody heard me, they would have not attacked me. Anyway, I did. I mean, this whole security thing I did for about 6 months, I think. And I worked there for about, I really can't remember now, 1 or 2 months. Often you'd get very odd assignments, you know, so that would be my main schedule, but then sometimes you'd go somewhere else for a while, or just one night on a building site and sit in a little cabin in London on a building site that anybody could have come in. And you didn't really have to do anything there. You just had to be awake overnight for 12 hours in a little porter cabin on your own, which was quite scary. You know, there was this building site. There was another one, an old relic of a building, McVitie's Biscuits, and the place stank. and it was empty. There was all this old manufacturing equipment. They'd clearly gone, but the building had nothing of value in it. But I suppose they wanted to stop squatters from getting in, or kids and all of that. So again, I can't remember where that was. It was somewhere in the west of London somewhere. And again, I'd get on the tube and you'd turn up, and there you are. You'd relieve the guard who was there in the day, and then at night time, again, you'd wander around this old factory. That was actually quite scary. But I remember there was this acrid smell in some of the rooms where there was dripping water, there was holes in the roof, and you'd go in, do the key, walk around, and then end up back in wherever the base was. And I seem to remember, maybe this was over the winter period, because actually I remember how cold it was, and you'd have the fire going in this front office, which of course didn't help because you wanted to nod off all the time. But it was, and I was just doing this whilst doing a bit of writing back in Harrow in my room, trying to work out what the hell I was going to do with the rest of my life. Meanwhile, I needed to earn money to pay the rent. So off I'd go. Another place I worked was at the South Bank, at the concert hall there, whatever it's called. It's the South Bank, you know, where they have the concerts and things. I can't remember the name of the place now. On the South Bank in London, at the Royal Festival Hall. There we are. It's just come to me. I know you were screaming at the screen. You go, no, what, the Royal Festival Hall? So they would. So I did not many, about 2 or 3 weeks there as a stint. There was a whole team of security guards there, and you would have various patrols. One of the main patrols was overnight, was moving, and I found this quite difficult. Moving the tramps, if you like, or the homeless, I suppose is a better way of putting it, who were living in cardboard boxes, and some of them would be on the edges of the Royal Festival Hall. That wasn't so nice. Sometimes we'd have people just drunk that we had to try and coax away, which was difficult. And other times people would be walking about with knives. And I remember one instance where a group of us had to go. I didn't really like to get involved, but there was some of the blokes there who were quite, you know, into that sort of thing. They loved the uniform, they loved the authority and walking about. They had all that. I was doing it purely for the money. I absolutely didn't like being a security guard. It was not my thing, but it was an eye-opener. I do remember, though, on the inauguration of it being shown around, one of the duties, because you got there at 7 o'clock, there would be concerts going on, and the concerts were great. So you'd be in the foyer, standing around, just making sure that nothing dodgy was going on. And sometimes people would come up to you and ask you where the loos are, so you could, you know, give a few directions. And actually, that I enjoyed interacting with the public, the general public, and when they would ask you questions, and I would then, personality could come out instead of just this sort of somber, neutral face that was just standing around leering at people, making sure they're all going in the right places and not going in the wrong doors. So that suddenly I felt, you know, that was good. But after the concert, we would go back to this general patrol and making sure that there was nobody there and checking the rooms and all of this. But I remember one guard who'd worked there for a long time. He said, "Here, come with me, Richard," and he took me upstairs into the roof space of the Royal Festival Hall, and we looked down, and there was this roof space in which it went right above where the orchestra would be playing, the stage where these, you know, classical concerts are being given. And there were walkways across, but with gaps so that you could look down. And, you know, looking down, it made me feel very queasy, but it was perfectly safe. And he said, this chap, this is despicable, it really is. He said, oh, well, when we get a big, you know, orchestra in there and they're playing stuff, he said, we usually get above things like the tuba. And he said, we can get above there and then we spit down into the horn of the tuba, which I thought was utterly disgusting. But they did it. I mean, it was a way to relieve the boredom, and they didn't care. They weren't that particularly bothered about classical music. But it was lovely to be there, because sometimes you could stand inside the auditorium and just make sure nothing was going on and actually listen to the concert. But that was rare. That was rare. I think I only did that about twice. But mostly it was with this team who you felt that they either thought they were in the army or that they were in a police force, all with walkie-talkies and, reporting back. And I remember there was a guy in there who, every time the radio would go, he would go, "Okay, send." And then there would be a report.
Yeah, everything okay on the such and such patrol?
I mean, it was fascinating to do it. Sorry, somebody started banging outside the house, which is very irritating. The last place, or another place that I did before I gave this whole thing up, was I was a security guard at TVAM. Now, TVAM was one of those early breakfast television stations, and it was in Camden Town. And it had all the famous people who was working there, names that people will remember, including the children's TV series or early kids series on a Saturday, Whack-A-Day. Well, I had a couple of interesting encounters with people there, and I'm going to save that for the next time I tell you about my story. So leaving you on tenterhooks here whilst my neighbour starts bashing and cracking whatever it is they're doing. So thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this, I will tell you more. Join me again next time. Till then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.